Hey everybody, welcome to episode 41 of the AskDAP show, where we answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. On this episode, we're talking about checking your MK7 Turbo for premature failure, TSI engine oil leaks, and capacitive discharges.
Evan A. via email says, "Hey, I had a question that I thought you guys could answer for me. I have a 2010 GTI with no mods done so far to the engine. I would like to buy an intake for it, but they're way too expensive in my opinion. From what I know, it's all about getting rid of the restrictions, so my theory is if I put stage 2 piping on the stock intake with a better drop-in filter, would that do the same as an intake, but for much less?"
Okay, so Evan, in regards to are there options to make a freer flowing intake without buying an intake? This is a tough question. Most of the restriction, at least from my understanding of how it's designed, I don't design intakes, so just keep that in mind, but this is just based on my experience over the years. Generally, the restriction that comes from intakes, factory ones, is actually the physical air box itself, not the actual tubes in the intake. So removing the air box is part of the reason why you get that freer flowing intake from that. So, you know, a lot of people obviously add free-flowing air filters like a K&N. So I can link to a K&N that we have available here, which is going to be a reasonable option. But the air box itself is kind of the restriction point. You know, I know on some of the cars they used to have the Swiss cheese model where they would just take a hole saw and drill a bunch of holes in the bottom of the air box to get as much air up into the intake as you possibly can without doing that. That would be an option for you. I don't really recommend it, but it is something that you can do to free up less of the restriction that comes from the air box being too enclosed and not enough air flowing in through the intake ports of the air box itself. So I wouldn't really recommend that, but that is an option for you if you don't want to buy an intake. The other alternative is maybe go down the route of something else that will give you more power other than intake. For example, software or a downpipe or something like that on your MK6 that will give you more power as opposed to intakes, which they increase power, but it's not as significant as other mods you can do to the car. So maybe start with other mods first and then go from there. I don't know how many mods you have, but software tuning is going to be your best mod, obviously, to start with. If you're not familiar, we can offer, we have the Unit Connect set up from Unitronic, which allows you to flash your car at home. I'll put a link to that here and you can check it out.
Justin A. via YouTube says, "Question for you. I have a 2009 CC with 81,000 miles. I have an oil leak. We have came to the conclusion that there's a seal that needs to be replaced. I'm assuming the crankshaft/camshaft seal. Is this something I can replace myself, or is it best to take to a mechanic?"
Justin, so when you say you're assuming it's a crankshaft seal, I don't really know what that means. Sounds like it's, if you've done a little bit of research, it sounds like maybe it's coming from the passenger side of the engine on the TSI, which if that's the case, there's a lot of different leak points on that side of the engine. And from all the VW techs I know, they always refer to that as a reseal because, at least from my understanding, when those leak, they leak in a couple different points. As far as I know, the cam cradle or the valve cover itself, which is all kind of one deal on a TSI engine, is a common leak point. They use this special flange seal and it's like $100 for a tube. We also offer a Worth version, which is a little bit less expensive than the factory stuff, which I'll link to here, but you can check out just to see what it is. But the cam cradle is a common point to leak and a lot of parts on that front side of the engine. So I know they do a complete reseal of everything on that side of the engine when they do it. And it is something you want to address because, like Charles, the humble mechanic, has mentioned in some of the video he did about failures, he talked about how water pump failures are often caused by a leak that is continued to allow it to leak, which eventually leaks down on top of the water pump, swells up that seal, and kind of blows everything out. So try to get the leak addressed. Probably not a DIY, depending on what your level of experience is. But I would definitely track down where the leak is coming from first before you make that decision.
James Salter via email says, "I have a 16 GTI and I would like to do anything possible to minimize carbon buildup. Where would you suggest introducing a vacuum carbon treatment solution, such as vacuum flush or seafoam, to the intake manifold? Also, would you recommend doing so as regular maintenance or a preventative measure against carbon buildup?
James, so in regards to carbon buildup on Mark 7s, it actually remains to be seen if the Mark 7 is going to have any significant carbon buildup, just because obviously there aren't enough out there with high mileage to really have a given track record for that. And in Europe, where they came out first, they actually have, I believe they have 8 total injectors. So you would have 4 that actually are in the cylinder and then 4 in the intake, intended for spraying under heavy load for, I believe it's for removal of carbon and things like that on deposits on the valve. So where to do it, I think there's a sensor at the front of the intake manifold, which you actually could remove while the engine is running, probably, and block it off and put a port in there in some way. That would be an option for you. I don't really know, it's one of those things that I've never seen anybody do a legitimate long-term test of a car. Let's say a car, for example, a TSI engine on the older models, do seafoam for 60K, let's say every 10,000 miles, and then pull the intake off and inspect to show, okay, here is a viable preventative for carbon buildup. It's really just speculation from people who have confirmation bias because they use it and they feel good about it, so they say it works and it's great. And most people would say, oh, well, I've never had any problems. And maybe it holds it off a little bit or just enough. The one thing I'll say is, a lot of times when you start talking about seafoaming your engine, let's say every 10K, when you start adding up the cost of that plus all the time you've invested and everything else, taking the intake manifold off every 70,000 miles might be less of a time and work and financial investment than all the seafoam you've spent for the past, let's say 4 years of driving. So, that's a tough decision for anybody to make. And if you feel compelled to do seafoam, that would probably be that intake port at the, that sensor port at the front of the manifold would probably be the best bet.
John Maffa via email says, I've got 3 questions regarding my 2012 Tiguan. Is there a way to do a complete reset of the computer system? I'm getting to the point where I need to service my brakes. What are the advantages and disadvantages of cross-drilled and vented rotors? Finally, the temperature gauge on the dash never reads higher than 190 degrees. It starts low and moves to 190 rather quickly, but never varies from that once it's warm. If you look at the OBD2 output, you can see the temperature in the engine changing. Is this normal, or should I look at replacing the temp sensor?
Okay, John, first of all, hey, thanks for the question. I know you comment on a lot of our videos and stuff like that, and you're really engaged in the community that obviously we put out there. In regards to the first question, removing, touching the battery cables together, that is something that Volkswagen does. It's actually something that it's kind of a running joke with most VW technicians, that whenever they call the Volkswagen technical helpline, the first thing they're going to ask them is if they did what they call a capacitive discharge. What a capacitive discharge is, you remove the battery cables from the battery, you hold them together, it allows all the residual power and everything in all the modules and everything else to kind of drain out, and will give you kind of a real reset on the battery. So that is something that would work on VWs. I'm not sure what your intent or purpose is for that, but yeah, that is an option for you. In regards to your second question on brakes, in regards to installing performance brakes on a car, performance brakes are not necessarily the best choice for everybody. It's really intended if you want improved braking. When you get to performance brakes, and mild performance brakes are not going to be as much with this as when you get to more advanced brakes, but the life of them is definitely going to be different than what your factory brakes are, as well as the overall comfort, the amount that they wear rotors. Let's say a harder brake pad that has more heavy compounds for stopping might wear brakes rotors a lot faster than just a standard organic metallic kind of pad mix that you would find from the factory. So maybe you might wear rotors quicker. Or noise is another factor. When you go for performance brakes, and it happens more on the aggressive side of performance brakes, more towards like track street pads, but when they're cold they make noise. So when you get, if you're okay with brake squealing, on startup, with then those street track pads would be maybe something that you'd want to go with. But a lot of people who are not heavily into modified cars are just looking for something that's a little bit more aggressive, in which case you could go with kind of a milder sport pad. But even then, the life may not be what your expectations are based on the factory brakes. So factory brakes are what I recommend for anybody who's not really into the modding thing. But if you're into modding your car and you want better stopping power, you have to understand that sometimes that comes with a compromise. Much like, you know, when you go for performance tires, you don't look for high performance all season tires and expect them to last 50,000 miles. It's just not realistic. So similar in the aspect of brakes, they're going to have similar wear characteristics, and depending on what's right for you, it may not be the best choice. It's really up to you to make that decision. In regards to your issue about the temperature gauge. So temperature gauges on all Volkswagen models since the Mark IV in the early 2000s didn't move once they start up. Your engine warms up, it hits the 190 mark, and then it will not move at all from there. This is actually done for what I assume to be for user, to make the user feel more comfortable, for people who are not familiar with cars and don't understand the fact that engines do fluctuate in temperature. So I assume that there's some sort of algorithm that actually doesn't cause it to fluctuate. It just sees an average running temperature, and as long as it's within a certain parameters, it's going to stick that needle right in the center until it really sees a problem, and then it will raise it up. So that's completely normal. You should expect that to be the case. And if it's moving while you're driving, even if it's dropping too cold or too hot, you know you have a problem. Generally, Volkswagens, when the thermostat fails, they tend to run cold, so it would not get up to temperature or drop below temperature while driving. So hopefully those answer your questions, and thanks so much.
Narwhals via VW Vortex says, I have an interesting question. Is there a way for a Mark 7 owner to self-check the stock turbo in order to identify a premature failure?
Okay, so we have answered a bunch of questions around Mark 7 turbos and their failures. I don't think I've ever answered this one specifically. So there is not really anything you could check per se, except for the fact of the way Mark 7 turbos tend to fail. From everything we know, most of the failures tend to have the nut actually come off the turbo wheel on the cold side, and then that nut will fall off, allowing the nut to go into the turbo, and also have a loose turbine wheel, which will then just eat everything alive and eventually explode the turbo. I guess technically you could check it to see if it's tight. The problem is I don't know a torque spec for that, and furthermore, I don't really like to mess with turbos because they spin at such a high RPM that tightening that potentially could cause some balance issues, or messing with the turbo could cause some balance issues. And when you spin something at 80 or 100,000 RPM like a turbo spins, doing that and not having it balanced could completely eat the turbo anyway. So you can check to make sure the nut is tight, and that way you can maybe identify prematurely that it's going to fail and somehow figure out an option for you. Maybe try to figure out a torque spec. VW wouldn't have a torque spec on something like that because it's not something that they would recommend as a rebuild of any kind. They would just replace the turbo. So if you can find a turbo rebuilder, maybe that would be a good choice. To find a turbo rebuilder, ask them if you do find it loose, ask them to help you. They can probably help determine what the correct way to handle that problem is if you found it loose. Thank you for watching episode 41 of the AskDAP Show, where we answer your Volkswagen and Audi questions. If you have any feedback or ideas on the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.